All right, so today we're gonna dive into a question that I think is just super fascinating.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
how do countries that industrialize lead? How do they actually manage to catch up?
Mm-hmm.
Do they just follow the same playbook as the early birds, like the Englands of the world?
All right. Yeah.
So, to really dig into this, we're going to be looking at Alexander Gerschenkron's essay on economic backwardness. And
Oh, classic.
yeah, it's a class. It's dense, but it's really insightful stuff.
It really is.
And to give us a little bit of
Better perspective.
a broader perspective, yeah,
Yes.
we're also going to be pulling in some ideas from Joseph Schumpeter's The Theory of Economic Development.
Yeah, Schumpeter really gets at the core of
Yeah.
what drives economic change. Innovation, new combinations.
Right, the kind of the engine of progress, whether you're you're a front runner or you're coming in from behind.
Exactly.
So, this idea that
That you just follow the same path.
yeah, that countries just kind of follow the same path.
Yeah.
Gerschenkron's like, no, not so fast. Right.
We're going to explore how this level of backwardness, like how far behind you are, actually determine not just how fast you industrialize,
Right.
but the very nature of that industrialization.
Yeah, the shape of it.
Yeah, the shape of it. Like what industries take off.
The institutions that are required.
Yeah, the institutions, even ideologies, like the belief systems that push the whole thing forward. So it turns out that starting late,
It's a different game.
it's a very different game. Yeah. Okay. So
Where do we start?
well, let's start with Gerschenkron's central argument,
Okay.
which is that
The experience of those early industrializers.
yeah, like England,
That's not a universal model.
right? It's not like a recipe book
Ex-
that everyone can just follow.
Right.
He's really pushing back against this idea, which was pretty common in Marxist thought,
Mm-hmm.
that history just kind of unfolds in these predictable stages.
Yeah, like a linear progression.
Yeah, and everyone's just kind of retracing the steps of the pioneers. And he says no, it's way more complex than that.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that he's saying the very fact of being backward
Right.
creates this unique set of pressures and opportunities
Totally.
that lead to fundamentally different paths of development.
It's not just a disadvantage.
Yeah.
It actually shapes the whole process.
Right. So it's not just being a little behind in school. It's
It's a whole different ballgame.
it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he even argues that
That this backwardness
yeah.
can actually have some advantages.
Yeah, it's
It's like waiting to buy the latest phone.
exactly. You skip over all those early buggy models.
Right. You get to jump right to the cutting edge.
Yeah, you get the best version right off the bat. He gives some great examples
Like the blast furnaces.
yeah, German blast furnaces quickly became, way better than the original English ones.
Right.
And then later Southern Russian furnaces were even more advanced than the German ones.
Yeah, they were leapfrogging each other
Yeah, it's not just that they caught up, it's that they were able to kind of skip ahead.
technologically.
Yeah, and avoid all the, the sunk costs and the limitations of those earlier designs.
It's like they had a clean slate
Yeah.
to work with.
And he contrasts this with England's dominance in textiles.
Mhm.
In the 19th century, they were so far ahead in that area
Right.
that there wasn't really the same pressure
Or opportunity.
or opportunity to kind of make those huge technological leaps.
So being the first mover isn't always the best position.
Right, right.
Interesting.
And he also talks about this this tension
Oh, yeah.
that exists in pre-industrial backward countries.
Like a sense of urgency.
Yeah, imagine a society that's acutely aware of its lower living standards. They
Okay.
see other nations that are more advanced.
They have the fancy new factory.
Yeah, they got the railroads, the cool stuff,
Yeah.
and it creates this palpable tension.
Right.
This kind of dissatisfaction, this yearning to catch up.
Like we're missing out.
Yeah, and Gerschenkron says that this gap between where they are,
And where they could be.
yeah, this gap between the current reality and the potential of industrialization
Right.
has to be strong enough to actually drive change.
To overcome all the inertia.
Yeah, to overcome all the hurdles that are in the
And
way.
old ways of doing things.
Yeah, the vested interests,
Yeah.
all of that stuff.
So it's not just about the technology existing somewhere else.
Right.
It's about the will to adopt it.
Yeah. It's got to be a societal push.
Yeah. A feeling that we need to do this.
And he even connects this to Toynbee's, challenge and response model.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, where, you need a significant challenge to trigger a substantial response.
Makes sense.
And in this case, that challenge is hey, we're behind.
We got to catch up.
We got to catch up.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we've got this tension, but how do they actually, like, act on it? How do they actually,
Mobilize.
yeah, mobilize resources,
Yeah.
organize their economies? Gerschenkron says that, because they're often short on capital.
They don't
Yeah.
have that gradual accumulation of wealth.
Yeah, and they might not have, like, a ton of experienced entrepreneurs.
Right.
They need to develop different institutional tools.
Different than what England had.
Yeah, than what those early industrializers had. So they have to get creative.
They got to find workarounds.
They got to find workarounds, and one of the biggest things he talks about is
Financial institutions.
financial institutions, yeah.
And how they adapt.
Yeah, so they got to figure out, like, okay,
How do we get the money?
yeah, how do we get the money to actually make this happen? And
One of the key examples he uses is...
banks, yeah, particularly in places like France and Germany.
Right.
So he talks about this rise of what he calls industrial banking,
Yeah.
and he highlights the Credit Mobilier in France
Oh, yeah.
under Napoleon III as like a prime example.
Okay.
And this wasn't like your typical bank that's just kind of sitting there passively holding deposits. Right.
These institutions were actively involved in, like, big investments.
Infrastructure projects.
Yeah, railroads infrastructure, like the foundations of an industrial economy.
Very proactive.
Yeah, it was a much more kind of hands-on approach to finance.
They weren't just lending money.
Yeah, they were really shaping the direction of development.
Interesting.
And what's fascinating is that
He talks about this resistance.
yeah, there was this resistance from, like, the old money, the established financial circles.
Yeah, the Rothschilds of the world.
Yeah, the Rothschilds, yeah, they're like, whoa, hold on.
This is not how we do things.
Yeah, this is too risky. This is too radical.
But the Credit Mobilier is doing well.
Yeah, but the Credit Mobilier and similar ventures,
They prove that it can work.
yeah, they prove it works, and they actually force,
The old guard to adapt.
yeah, even the Rothschilds eventually have to kind of get on board with these new, more interventionist approach.
Approaches to funding industrial growth. So in these situations where capital is scarce,
You need these centralized institutions.
yeah, they become vital to kind of,
Pool the resources.
yeah, pool the resources and make these big investments that wouldn't happen otherwise.
It's a very different model than that sort of gradual organic growth
Right.
that you saw in England
Yeah.
with lots of small entrepreneurs and things.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so then you have Germany and
Universal banks.
yeah, the universal banks, they take this even further.
Oh, yeah.
They combine long-term investment with commercial banking activities.
So they're doing everything.
Yeah, they're doing everything.
Yeah.
And Gerschenkron points out how these banks develop these really close relationships.
With industrial enterprises.
Yeah, with these industrial enterprises, it's almost like they become partners.
From cradle to grave.
Yeah, from cradle to grave.
Mhm.
They're not just providing capital,
Right.
they're involved in management.
Really shaping the strategy.
Yeah, and they're even fostering the creation of cartels. So they're really playing a much broader role than just like a lender.
It's almost like they're part of the industry itself.
Yeah, it's a very intertwined system.
So this is how Germany kind of overcomes its lack of...
Yeah, that lack of widespread capital and experience.
Right, by centralizing those functions.
Yeah, within these powerful banking institutions.
Okay, so we've seen France, we've seen Germany.
Mm-hmm.
What about Russia?
Now, Russia, this is where the degree of backwardness really starts to matter.
Okay.
Gerschenkron argues that Russia was so far behind.
Burdened by serfdom.
Yeah, burdened by serfdom until 1861.
Right, so much later than the rest of Europe.
Yeah, that even these fancy new banks
Couldn't do it alone.
couldn't do it alone. They couldn't mobilize enough capital.
And there was so much distrust
Yeah, there's this widespread distrust.
of anything new.
Yeah, of anything new. So what happens when even these like innovative financial systems aren't enough?
Well, Gerschenkron says that
The state has to step in.
the state has to become the driver.
Yeah, in these cases of extreme backwardness,
It's the only way.
it's the only way. So in Russia, the state becomes this central engine of economic progress. And they're motivated a lot by military concerns.
Cool.
This is something that comes up a lot in Gerschenkron's analysis of Russia.
Right. They've always got one eye on their rivals.
Yeah, they always feel like they're playing catch up in terms of military power.
So they need to industrialize quickly.
Yeah, they need to industrialize to be able to defend themselves.
Right.
So the government spearheads railway construction.
Huge infrastructure projects.
Yeah, huge infrastructure projects. They give preferential treatment to domestic producers.
Protectionism.
Yeah, protectionism. They offer subsidies. They offer credits.
They're basically controlling the flow of capital.
Yeah, they're controlling the financing of industrialization.
So it's a very top-down approach.
Yeah, it's a very top-down approach, and he acknowledges...
The downsides.
Yeah, there's inefficiencies.
There's corruption.
Yeah, there's corruption. It's not a perfect system.
But it's effective.
Yeah. But it's effective in terms of actually driving progress.
They get the job done.
They get the job done, yeah. And he points to figures like Vishnegradsky and Witt, who are these like key ministers who really pushed this state-led development.
They were the architects of industrialization.
Yeah, and it's just a completely different animal.
Than what we saw in Germany.
Yeah, than what we saw in Germany, which was more kind of like bank-supported, decentralized growth.
Right.
So it's really fascinating to see how the level of backwardness
determines the path.
Yeah. And he gives this really cool illustration within the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Okay.
He compares Austria, which was less backward relative to Germany, and Hungary, which was further behind.
Sure.
And in Austria, the banks played a significant role.
Like we saw in Germany.
Yeah, like we saw in Germany.
Okay.
But in Hungary, the government really had to intervene directly.
To push industrialization.
Yeah. And even though they started out focusing on light industry, they eventually had to shift to heavy industry.
Because they needed to catch up.
Yeah, they needed to catch up, and the state had to kind of like muscle its way into that process.
So even within the same empire, you see different paths.
You see different paths based on that level of backwardness.
That's a great example.
So it's not just about institutions, though.
Right.
Gerschenkron also talks about the role of ideologies.
And belief systems.
Yeah, the belief systems. And he argues that these backward countries often need...
Powerful ideologies.
Yeah, powerful ideologies to overcome resistance to change.
Right.
And to mobilize the effort that's required for rapid industrialization.
It's not just about economic incentives.
Right. It's about...
a sense of purpose.
Yeah, a sense of purpose, a sense of urgency.
A national mission.
Yeah, a national mission.
Okay.
So he looks at Saint-Simonianism in France.
Oh, interesting.
Which was this early 19th century ideology that basically championed the idea of industrial progress.
Progress through science and technology.
Yeah, progress through science and technology.
Right.
And it resonated with this need for rapid change.
In France?
Yeah, in France.
Okay.
And it appealed to capitalist entrepreneurs.
Even though it had some socialist elements.
Yeah, it had some socialist elements, but like guys like the Perrer, who were these like big industrialists, they were drawn to this emphasis on industrialization.
And the power of banks.
Yeah, the transformative power of banks. So it's like this kind of...
technologically driven progressivism.
Yeah, and he contrasts this with England, where the acceptance of free trade was much more...
rational.
Yeah, rational, logic-driven.
Right.
And then you have Friedrich List in Germany.
Oh, yeah.
Who basically takes those Saint-Simonian ideas and kind of translates them...
into a nationalist framework.
Yeah, into a nationalist framework, which makes sense in the German context because they're still, trying to unify as a nation. And they're kind of late to the industrialization game.
So nationalism becomes a powerful motivator.
Yeah, it becomes this rallying cry.
Okay.
And what's really striking is his analysis of Orthodox Marxism in Russia.
Interesting.
So Gerschenkron argues that Marxism provided this intellectual justification, almost like an iron law of history for capitalist industrialization.
Even though it's supposed to be anti-capitalist.
Yeah, it's this weird kind of like...
paradox.
Yeah, paradox, but it helps to reconcile the Russian intelligentsia.
To all the upheaval.
Yeah, to all the upheaval, the decline of the old social structures.
Even if they weren't fully on board with Marxist socialism.
Right. It gave them a framework to kind of make sense of what was happening.
Like, this is necessary.
Yeah, this is the inevitable path of history.
So again, in this context of absolute backwardness, you need a really strong ideology.
You need a really strong ideology to kind of push things forward. Yeah. And it's fascinating to see how these different ideologies, this kind of like...
technologically driven progressivism in France?
Yeah, nationalism in Germany.
Yeah, historical inevitability in Russia.
Yeah, all of these served as these crucial catalysts.
In their own way.
In their own way, yeah. So, so they're industrializing, they're catching up, but what happens is they start to close that gap?
Do the institutions and ideologies stay the same?
Yeah, Do they remain as important?
That's a good question.
So Gerschenkron argues that successful industrialization
Leads to less backwardness.
yeah, it kind of like diminishes the backwardness and that changes the relationship between
Institutions and industry.
yeah, so for example in Germany,
Okay.
as industries matured and they started to accumulate their own capital.
Became more independent.
Yeah, they became more independent from the banks.
They didn't need them as much.
Yeah, they didn't need them as much. They could diversify their financing.
They could stand on their own 2 feet.
Yeah, so that initial heavy reliance on the banks.
It starts to fade.
Yeah, it starts to fade.
Right.
And even in Russia.
After that initial state-led push,
Yeah, after the state kind of like kick-started things.
the banks start to play a bigger role.
Yeah, they start to see the emergence of more commercial banks.
More like what we're used to.
Yeah, more like what we're used to, and they slowly start to adopt more like Western business practices.
So the financial landscape is evolving.
Yeah, it's evolving.
Okay.
And this is where I think Schumpeter's perspective on economic development
Becomes really relevant.
becomes really relevant because he emphasizes that development isn't just about
Accumulating capital.
or catching up.
It's about innovation.
Yeah, it's fundamentally driven by what he calls new combinations.
Intercombinations.
Yeah, so this is like new products,
New ways of producing things.
new ways of producing things,
New markets.
new markets, new sources of supply, new forms of organization.
So it's about doing things differently.
Yeah, it's about being creative. It's about finding new ways to do things.
And you can see how Gerschenkron's observations about backward countries adopting advanced technology fit into this idea of new combinations.
Yeah, it's like that tension that he describes in pre-industrial societies.
Creates this fertile ground.
Yeah, it creates this fertile ground for these Schumpeterian innovations.
The breakthrough.
Yeah, to break through the stagnation. And it's a chance to implement these like cutting edge ideas.
That haven't been tried before.
Yeah, that haven't been tried before in that specific context.
Interesting.
And Schumpeter also highlights the role of the entrepreneur.
The agent of creative destruction.
Yeah, the agent of creative destruction. These are the people who dare to actually implement these new combinations.
They're the risk takers.
Yeah, they're the risk takers, the visionaries, and they often face huge challenges.
And they need certain qualities.
Yeah, they need certain qualities to succeed.
Like resilience.
Yeah, resilience.
A willingness to fail.
Yeah, and Gerschenkron kind of touches on this implicitly when he talks about the greater effort in leadership.
That's required in less developed economies.
Yeah, it's not just about like passively adopting technology.
Right.
It's about that entrepreneurial spirit.
That drive to actually implement it.
Yeah, that drive to implement it and create these new economic realities.
Okay, so it's a more active process.
Yeah, it's a much more active process.
Interesting.
But Gerschenkron also, he's not all like roses and sunshine about this. He cautions about
The potential downsides.
the potential downsides of being too far behind for too long.
Right.
He says, there can be significant social tensions, problems with overpopulation.
Just a lot of instability.
Yeah, a lot of instability. And he uses the historical example of Soviet Russia
Oh, yeah.
as kind of like an extreme case.
Where the delayed industrialization
Yeah.
contributed to the revolution.
Yeah, it contributed to the revolution and the rise of this dictatorial regime.
That used forced industrialization.
Yeah, that used forced industrialization as this brutal means of
Consolidating power.
yeah, consolidating power. And he points out that, the focus on heavy industry in the Soviet Union
Wasn't unique.
yeah, it wasn't unique to backward countries, but the scale and the methods
Were extreme.
were extreme. It was just this like incredibly harsh and top-down approach.
A cautionary tale.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale about what can happen when that tension of backwardness
Goes too far.
yeah, goes too far and it boils over into like
Social and political upheaval.
yeah, and ultimately he concludes that there's this significant interconnectedness between economic backwardness,
Rapid industrialization.
yeah, rapid industrialization, authoritarianism,
And conflict.
yeah, and conflict and the Soviet experience is like this powerful, troubling historical example of this complex interplay.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. So I guess like bringing it all together, the core message from Gerschenkron's work, especially when we consider it alongside, Schumpeter's ideas about innovation,
Right.
is that the journey to industrialization is not
A one-size-fits-all.
yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all process. The degree to which a country is initially behind
Shapes everything.
shapes everything. It shapes the speed, the specific industries that take off.
The institutions.
Yeah, the institutions, the ideologies, like everything is kind of filtered through that lens of backwardness.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's really relevant for understanding
the challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, the challenges and opportunities that developing nations face today.
Absolutely.
This desire for rapid industrialization, this focus on adopting advanced technologies.
It makes sense in their context.
It makes sense in their context. Yeah, it's not necessarily misguided.
Right.
It can be understood through this lens of, their historical starting point.
And that tension of backwardness.
Yeah, the tension of backwardness that Gerschenkron so brilliantly laid out for us.
It's a really insightful framework.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
It's like considering these historical perspectives.
What are the biggest challenges today?
Yeah, what are the biggest challenges and what are the unique advantages?
For countries trying to develop in the 21st century.
Yeah, in the 21st century with, the current global landscape.
And all the rapid technological change.
Yeah, the rapid technological change. It's a whole new ball game.
It is.
But I think these historical lessons can still teach us a lot.
Definitely food for thought.
Yeah, food for thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Likewise.
All right, until next time.
See ya.